back, everybody.
Hey.
This is Bad Marriages in the Bible, and we are your hosts. I'm Sean.
I'm Kate.
And we are married, and we run Dandelion Ministries, which creates space for you to experience the grace of Jesus Christ in your place of need. And we do that through creative means, through art and music and retreats and podcasts like this. So we are glad to be back with you. We were running a retreat and weekend for church last week, so it prevented us from getting to this. So that's why we had the week off, but we are back, and we're going to be walking through the Bible as we have been, looking at the marriages. And we say bad marriages because we want you to be like, oh, that's interesting, and listen to the show. So that's why we said
rhymes.
that.
It's catchy.
And but they're just marriages, and they are full of broken people, as we always say. And so that's why we want to look at them, because that's where we experience our sin so often, is in our primary relationships. And we want us all to experience God's grace where we need it. And so these marriages bring that up all the time. And we have gotten to Esther. So we are going to look at the book of Esther for the next few episodes and talk about that very interesting marriage. It is certainly not a great one in terms of how it was started and the foundations of it, and but it is also what created the Bachelor and the Bachelorette and the Golden Bachelor and the Golden Bachelorette and all that. It is all based on the book of Esther. I'm sure you didn't know that, but that's what those producers were reading.
It's true. This is an ancient Hebrew Bachelor.
Yeah, Persian even.
Show.
Yeah, that's right.
It actually lends itself really well to being a play. Some even disputed, could this possibly be true? Because it's written so well, and it's got these wonderful acts to it, and it has a beautiful story arc. But we would argue that, yes, it is in fact true.
And it's beautifully written.
And it's also...
The two things can be happening at the same time.
Yes, there are things that root it in history. Ahasuerus is also called Artaxerxes, and he was a real guy who's in history outside of biblical texts. And he's referenced also in the book of Nehemiah, which we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah a couple podcasts ago. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 6 talks about how difficult it was to rebuild the wall, and the local governors of the who were overseeing the Jews in Jerusalem were working against the Jews and didn't want the wall to be built. And so they, and Nehemiah had heard about this, and he goes to King Artaxerxes, and the queen is sitting next to him, and he asks for a favor to be able to go back to Jerusalem to help rebuild the wall. And that little line, and the queen was next to him, and Artaxerxes does grant him permission to go back, and blesses him, and sends people with him. And it just goes to show how significant the queens were to the Persian kings. And so right after Nehemiah, we have the book of Esther, and here we have an up close and personal of that, very quickly shown in Nehemiah 2, verse 6. We have King Artaxerxes. Maybe this is the next in line to that Nehemiah king, the Persian king. So this might be the son of that king or the father. We're not quite sure.
Yeah, there's a little debate amongst the scholars as to if this is Xerxes or Artaxerxes II. So but it's in that family line. At the very least, it is directly connected to the Persian kings that God moved on their hearts to let the Jews go back to their land and to rebuild.
And there's one other dispute over Esther couldn't possibly be true, because in the extra biblical historical texts, Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes, there's no mention of Esther or Vashti, which are the two queens that are in the book of Esther. But the counter argument to that would be Vashti did not give him an heir, and it's possible Esther did not give him an heir. And so they only recorded the queens who did give the king heirs, male heirs. So it's very possible, for that to be still a viable queen, but it just didn't make it into the Persian records.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true. So this is just to give you some historical context of where we are and to understand that there is real historical grounding for this book to be actual fact. And it is really well written. It is universally accepted that way in terms of Hebrew literature. And so it's worth a read. And we are catching up to this story, and it just kind of drops us in. As Kate said, many of the Jews have gone back to Israel, to Palestine, to rebuild the temple, and yet many of them did not. And that's what we see here. We see Esther, her family, it would have been her parents that decided not to go back, and then Mordecai, her uncle. And we catch up to them, and they're still in Persia. And as we look at this, there's a good reason. So we're going to follow the story, and God has kept some of them there. And we're going to see this story that never actually mentions God. It never mentions any prophecies about the Messiah or anything like that. It's a very human story. But we're watching how God and his sovereignty works through his people.
And
his
the unlikely messengers, the unlikely thing,
right?
Which is what he did through Jesus, and how he's sovereign and in control of all of history. Whether people write his name down or not, you see God's hand all over the place.
Right. Yeah. This is a story of redemption. It's a story of protection. It's a story of him keeping his promises. And we see that because it's through his people and the way he works this out through Esther. And so we get dropped right in to the king and him throwing an enormous celebration. That's how the book opens. He threw a party for over 180 days, which is a school year. For you who don't have a concept of what that amount of time is, that's how many days our kids are required to be in school in this country. And so that's a huge, long party, a really big one. And then it says after the celebration was over, he threw another party that lasted for like a week. And so that's what's happening. And he's eating and drinking and being merry with all of his friends, and he's showing off. And it's showing that he ruled a very, very large kingdom. It starts out in verse 1 that he ruled over 127 provinces from India all the way to Ethiopia. So that's a very big kingdom that Ahasuerus is in charge of. And he's celebrating his reign, and he throws this enormous feast. And it takes time to describe like the decor, which I find interesting, just because it's kind of what, but it does, the white curtains, violet hangings, and all that kind of stuff. So just showing the wealth that he has, and it's also showing kind of the hedonism on one level, I guess. It's just kind of showing the celebration of his own power and how he thinks he's the stuff. And it tells us that he is married to Queen Vashti, and Vashti gives a feast for the women at the same time. And when they get to this second party, the kind of after party of the big party, it says that the king was merry with wine. His heart was merry with wine. He was drunk, and he's sitting there with his eunuchs and his leaders, and he tells them, that's what it says,
hanging out with my eunuchs.
This is his posse, and he says he wants to bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. And there are some commentators that say there's an implicit message here that she would have come and been only in her crown, and to show her off, to make a spectacle of her. But regardless, it was really just he wanted to display his power through the fact that he could have such a beautiful queen.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to kind of just objectify her in front of all these people and just show her off. This is my trophy wife.
Mm-hmm. Have them all lust after her, but he belongs to her.
Right, but she's the forbidden thing because she's his, and so it's like ownership. It is just a blatant display of patriarchy, for lack of a better word. It's really just a display of the fact that women were more possessions as opposed to equals at that time,
and quite selfish and self-serving. So
yeah.
I would say the text is what happens is
what
she
happens?
refuses.
She says no.
And she refuses to come, and then their reaction is really funny. Esther chapter 1 verses 17 and 18, and all the guys in the room are like, oh my gosh, Vashti refused to come.
Yeah, these are his wise men, it says.
Yes, she refused to come. If word gets out about this, then all the women will start refusing to come to us when we command. And they were so worried that word would get out amongst the other noble women and perhaps around the land.
AKA their wives.
Yes. Oh my gosh. They didn't even know this was a possibility.
Yeah,
and now it's been done, and they won't obey us the same way. And so you see the text making fun of all of this cultural patriarchy, that this is not the way God intended marriage. This is an example of, as you said, hedonism, selfishness, oppression, possession. It is not at all what God intended for a man and a woman to become one flesh, or what a good ruler, of a land would be. And so their response in verses 17 and 18, I would say the text is having a little bit of fun with it. They're not going to obey us at all. We have to silence her. And so instead of word getting out that she refused to come, let's say, instead of saying she dumped me, I'm going to say, no, I dumped her.
Right.
And we're going to spread that rumor around the school. I dumped her. And so that's what they decide to share around the kingdom, that King Ahasuerus has refused to let Vashti come into his presence again. She's been cast out. He's trying to silence her. But then, of course, this text is written down. And so her story continues to be told. And his selfish ambitions and the corrosive cultural norms are exposed by the fact that this is written down. The message does get out for her, for, the behind the scenes of how bad their marriages are. And it ends Act 1 with the message that they share, that they want to be shared. And it's spread around the whole region, that says there's an edict in every province in its own language that women have to obey their husbands and do what they say. And that's how Act 1 ends. And the scene ends. And so you see the power of a message getting out. We've got to silence this so that her message doesn't get out. We want to send out a faulty message, but the text is sharing the true message. And I think that lends itself to why the Bible was written down, that God had some good news to tell us and to tell people caught in bad marriages, to tell victims who are feeling oppressed and powerless under, a self-serving, selfish power structure that just acts on a whim, acts on its own arrogance, acts on its own, ego, that there is a God who's bigger than that power, who is a deliverer, and who is stronger than any power on earth. We see how rich he is. The text makes sure for us to know how rich and powerful and how he's in control of everything. But we see God who's even stronger, overseeing all of this. And Vashti is a victim here, but her story is told. And that's the whole Bible is written down so that this message would get to you, that there is a God who is stronger in your powerlessness. In your powerlessness, we're all the Xerxes in this story, too. Our own selfishness has run away with us, and we've gotten, we've been tooting our own horn, and showing off. I mean, who hasn't gone through grade school without doing that daily? And, we need to be rescued from that kind of thing, especially in marriage. You see how toxic it is. And so there is a stronger message that God is delivering us from the Xerxes within, and that he is a forgiving God. These are exiles, who were out there in Persia because they had turned against God, and he had given them a taste of the consequences of their sin by exiling them. He himself was going to take the full blow of what it takes to forgive somebody by dying on the cross. And so he would take the full blow of the consequences of our sin. But they're out there, in Persia because they were getting a taste of it. But even in that taste of the consequences of their own selfishness and their own turning away from God, and once you turn away from God, then you are toxic towards other people and towards yourself. He was still faithful to them and still sent his people to them and still committed himself to them and still worked redemption all over the place. So only Jesus took the full weight of that. And so we see God being faithful, sending that message out to his exiles, Esther and Mordecai, and they didn't return back. They were maybe getting a little, maybe they liked the Persian culture. It looked a lot better than having to go back to dirty, broken Jerusalem and rebuild it. So they wanted to stay. It was a long journey. Mordecai is not young anymore. And God was still faithful to them and coming and helping them. Yes, they were dealing with the difficulties of the Persian culture, as you can see here, with all the patriarchy and the not being in control and being under the thumb of, unpredictable, selfish ruler. So they were dealing with those things. But you see God sending the message out to them. I am there. I am with you. And I'm going to, enter in to deliver and to save.
Yeah. And it's a picture. It's an interesting thing that the wise men all say when they sum up, when the king asks them, what should I do? They do what we love to do, which is kind of like we take offense, and they also just display the control that they want to have, and how we hate when that gets confronted or gets challenged. And they say that in the, Queen Vashti hasn't done this against just you. She's done it against us and, against all the officials, all the peoples who are in the provinces of the king. And so they, as Kate said, it gets very humorous because it sounds so stupid. But that is what they do. They're afraid of losing control. And we see just how toxic that is in a marriage relationship. And we also see the kind of recklessness of humanity here, because the king, when he just doesn't get his way, he's like, that sounds like a good idea. And it's so relatable in many ways that is how, some people want to dismiss this story as being not historical because the king is such a reckless guy and so easily kind of moved by his advisors. But I mean, has anybody ever paid attention to American politics? Like, that's what happens. And so this is something that we see here. But as Kate said, the Lord is going to use all of this. We don't know how just yet. But Vashti's resistance here is actually setting the table for God to really redeem this whole situation. And it's even though they didn't go back to Israel, Israel is still under the rule of the king of Persia, and so everything that he does is going to impact God's people. And so the fact that God has kept Esther and Mordecai, we haven't even met yet in the story, in Israel, or excuse me, in Persia, is not an accident. And he's going to actually deliver his people once again, and from the most unlikely place, which we're going to read more about next time. But this is a picture, as Kate was saying, of God defending and standing up for the victim, and being and seeing them. It's like we've said with Hagar in the past. That he sees and he knows, and that he is the one to defend us, and that he's going to do that. And so it's an interesting setup for what comes next. We see a king who is impressionable, and he's going to, when he kind of, if it kind of affects him directly, then he cares, and if it doesn't, he's kind of flippant. And so we're going to kind of watch that play out as the story goes on. And I guess I wanted to bring us back to just the marriage bit. That this is not a picture of an equal marriage. It's not a picture of the two people being sensitive to the others. You see one who has all the power, and then you see the other who, what little power she has, she exercises it, because you pick up when you read between the lines that Vashti did not appreciate the way she was treated by King Ahasuerus in general. The fact that she was like, no, I'm not doing that, is a dramatic thing. It really is like a serious thing she has done in terms of culture. So like the official's response is the way the culture responds to this. I'm amazed they didn't call for her head right away.
I know.
But at the very least, she is a brave woman who stands up against an abusive husband, which is what this is, frankly. And that idea of control, I mean, this is something that challenges us. It's the rub in marriage often, is when we both have an idea of what we want or where things should go, or, kind of how we want things to play out, and the other has a different view. It's always a challenge in a marriage. So, and this is one where that is happening, and there's disagreement, right? I mean, this is what one of our mentors used to say to us was, when you get two or more people together in a room, expect conflict. And a marriage has at least two people in it. And just as we've covered, we're not polygamists. But and so there's always going to be conflict that we have to get through. And in this story, we're not getting a picture at all of
two equals
of a healthy marriage. Yeah.
No, this is oppression. This is oppression and abuse. And she was right to refuse, and right, it's really a mercy. I mean, she probably was homeless, like, thrown out into poverty.
Yeah.
With who would take her back in, perhaps her family, though they'd be disappointed in her. So she was going to suffer for this, but it was still worth it, more than living in the riches, but being a sex slave, or being under an oppressive power. So that was better than it was better to leave and to have the consequence of poverty than to stay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in any abusive situation, there's nothing noble about staying in it. So, which I think sometimes has been thought of anyway in the church. There's some, like we've talked about that before, that somehow people get confused and think the Bible's advocating for us to stay in bad marriages, abusive marriages, and it's not, and it is not good for you. And so we applaud Vashti for sure. And like you said, it's been written down so that we could see it. And And I'm so glad she did leave. And it's God also using her to set the table for the next scenario with Esther when she's brought into the picture. But yeah. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Just, if we can pull back a little bit from the very specific abuse situation that we're seeing in this passage, but just what it's like to give up control or to contend with the fact that our being with someone else challenges us. I know for me, it's like, that's one of the things they say, in marriage and in marriage counseling and things like that, if you want to see how selfish you are, get married. It reflects back to you like the way that you think things should run and work. And you're always having to contend with somebody else and engage with them. And that is a challenging thing. It's a challenging thing. But it's a blessing. I mean, that's one of the things that I think I've learned in our marriage is just how my perspective is not the only perspective. And how there's often an angle that I just do not see when we're looking at things together, and you bring that in, and I'm always really grateful for that and helped by it. And but it's like, this is, I guess what I want to say is that this is part of where intimacy really is formed, is when these conflicts come up. Not the kind that Vashti, not the kind that Vashti was dealing with, but just in general in a marriage, when you're dealing with
somebody who has a different point of view or has different desires than you.
Do you think is that accurately described? Or like that it's for me anyway, that's how I would describe it. There's something about my control that's being challenged and I don't like it.
Sure. Yeah. I'm having a hard time letting go of the text because I'm like, I do not think that there's anything
I feel like we've addressed it.
redemptive in this.
I'm not saying there's
interaction, but
it brings up the issue
separately. In a marriage that's not abusive or, completely lopsided with one oppressing the other,
right,
or, objectifying or treating the other as a possession. But if we were now switching gears into,
I was trying to switch gears.
what God has held out as two equals becoming one flesh, that means that there would be two different points of view that will clash eventually. But in that clash, we talk a lot on this show about the fact that intimacy is not sameness. It is coming together and even reconciling in difference.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you feel the intimacy. So in the working through something where you have different points of view, to be able then to work through it will produce the fruit of safety, of deeper love for each other, deeper appreciation from the different points of view, different gifts, reconciliation if that's needed, forgiveness. So there's a lot of very good fruit that comes out of, the rub of having two different points of view, for sure.
Yeah. And we all think that it would be nice to just have somebody agree with us all the time, but it gets really boring. It's like, that's not why you got married in the first place. So yeah. And we're going to wrap up here, but we have a communications course that we do and that we've really benefited from, that helps to do this very thing, to actually create space so that both people's views get the time of day. And we've mentioned it, I think, before on the show, but it is a really helpful thing to create that safe space where you're both feeling heard, and you can both then work through whatever issue it is and come to a place of understanding, not necessarily agreement, because that sometimes doesn't happen, but understanding each other is the goal. And that really is, intimacies goes deeper there when you really have been heard and understood. That's the thing that actually creates more love and affection between the two of you, as opposed to agreement. We think agreement's the thing, but it's not really. So
Agreement's not the thing. That's right. And you'll know that you've hurt each other because, in this first act here, he wants to silence her, and tell his story only. But if God has helped you work through a difference and you've come to a place of understanding, you will be able to voice what their side is without rancor, and vice versa. You will actually voice and, demonstrate, not just say, I understand, but demonstrate understanding by being able to tell back to them what their side was.
Mm-hmm.
And even champion that. I mean, what hope is there for the Democrat and the Republican in a marriage? If you can't come to an understanding and appreciate the things that are really important to that other person, even though you might have differences, but to understand those about each other and be able to voice it and, be able to reflect back, yeah, this is what they think, and without shaming, without trying to silence, without, but that's a form of honoring and loving somebody else by seeing the differences. And that only happens through God's love for us first, reconciling two different people, tearing down that hostility, bringing his forgiveness, being in the midst of them, coming to you in the midst of the opposition, of the conflict or whatever that, or the differences of opinion. So we see that in the text. God is very attentive to this power differential, and he's more powerful than it. But then in marriages today, there's hope if you're in a difference of opinion, because God can actually use that to create greater intimacy. And by hearing one another out, being able to voice what that other, say back to them, their very words. That's the best way. Don't put a spin on it, but reflect back what their actual words are. And that will lead you to a place of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's lots of hope for you out there if you're having a disagreement in your marriage, and if you're not, praise God. And we are just excited to be back with you. We've got more Esther coming to you. We have in the show notes, as always, ways for you to learn more about Dandelion at our website. There is a opportunity for you to send questions and or prayer needs to us, and there's also a way to support the show, as everything we do is supported by generous people like you. And so we'd love to have you check those things out. Please subscribe to the show, like the show, share the show with your friends and family. And we are so grateful for your time and for listening. So we hope to see you again next time.
Have a great day.
Bye.